Hello, my name is Emily Depew, and I am a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program, presented by the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you about today's program. Please let us know your feedback by contacting us on social media or via email at doleinstitute@ku.edu. To view past programs, visit our online video archive at www.doleinstitute.org. A video of today's presentation will be available on our website soon. We would like to encourage each of you to consider becoming friends of the Dole Institute. Our friends help keep our programs free and open and support archive research and our student activities. Please contact us if you are interested. After the presentation, we will have time for some audience to ask questions. If you have a question, raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you're able and ask just one brief question. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now please join me in welcoming the Associate Director and Director of Museum Archives at the Dole Institute, Audrey Coleman.
November of 17, is that right?
Yes. Thank you, Emily. What an honor it is to be with you all today on our first event of the new year in 2020 here at the Dole Institute. I was quizzing Dr. Cotter and discussing with our Dole Institute director. And does anybody have any idea how many years have we been doing the Fort Leavenworth series here at the Dole Institute? No guesses. 10. That's a pretty close. We were saying, well, 5, 6. No, it's 9 years. This is 9 years that we've been doing this series. It's one of our most popular series. We always get a crowd here for the lectures from our faculty at the Staff College. YouTube statistics. Any of you who are YouTubers out there? We have 5,000s, 10,000s of views on each one of these programs, up to over 100,000 on a couple of them from 2014 and 2015. So it's just an outstanding opportunity to collaborate with the faculty at the Staff College and for us here at the Dole Institute. So my pleasure to welcome you again for this year's series. One public service announcement regarding other activities here at the Dole Institute. Our new reading room has been recently renovated, and we're getting ready to rededicate that as the Elizabeth Dole Gallery and Reading Room. It's right across the hall of the Museum Gallery. We have a new exhibit featuring an exhibit called What Would a Woman Do for Her Country? Elizabeth Dole's groundbreaking trailblazing life of service. We're the new repository for Senator Elizabeth Dole's career papers, and there is an exhibit dedicated to her career in that new reading room. So we'd love to see you over there sometime when you're here for the Fort Leavenworth series. I won't take any more of your time, and right now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Cotter, the Director of the Command General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth.
Thank you very much. And it's great to see again so many familiar faces here. Thank you very much for your support of this program, which we very much enjoy participating in. And this is the inaugural event of our Turning Points theme for 2020, and we have a great menu of things coming up. Number one, of course, will be Dr. Abel's presentation on Napoleon and the Fifth Coalition. Dr. Abel's been a member of the DMH faculty since 2017. He came on board after taking his PhD at the University of North Texas. He is the author of a book on Guibert, the father of Napoleon's Grande Armée. His interests are not just Napoleonic. He has a wide area of interest, most of them in European history, but also back to ancient Rome and Greece as well. And so will you help me in welcoming Dr. John Abel, please?
Thank you, and good afternoon. So I've titled my presentation, as you can see, the War of the Fifth Coalition in 1809, Napoleon's Turning Point. And if you know anything about Napoleon, if you know anything about his career and his history, and especially his military career, that might seem kind of puzzling to you. Because it's pretty well established that Napoleon had two pretty definite turning points. One of them in Spain, the first invasions in 1807, the takeover of the state in 1808, the famous painting of the Dos de Mayo that you see there, the uprising of the Spanish partidos. That is a turning point. Napoleon gets bogged down in Spain, but more than anything, Spain is a turning point because the British were there. We read most of our history in English. The British, of course, have a monopoly on English written history for a while. We adopt a lot of those mores. And that's not to say that Spain is not important or is not a turning point. It obviously is. But I think its importance has been exaggerated, especially, again, in the Anglophone world, because that's where the British are. They focus on that. They focus away. They don't focus on things that are away from that all that much, which means that's what American scholars have done for a long time as well. Two, I don't think Spain is as important or as impactful as it's often made out to be, simply because what Napoleon was doing there, he's doing in a lot of other places as well. Not to the same degree, not to the same magnitude, but it's not quite as important as it might seem. The other turning point, as you see there in the upper corner, is, of course, Russia. When Napoleon invades Russia, the original War of 1812, massive army, almost 1 million men, a lot of it is left behind, a lot of it is destroyed, and then, of course, from then on, Napoleon is on the defensive until eventually he has to abdicate. That obviously is a turning point as well. What I'm going to propose in this talk, though, is that 1809 is a turning point because we can see the seeds of his defeat being sown there. A lot of the elements of what will eventually bring him down and what he will eventually contribute to his downfall are first seen in 1809, in a way we don't see in Spain prior to that, and in a way that Russia kind of capitalizes on. And in particular, one of the reasons why 1809 is kind of ignored, or at very least passed over in favor of these other two, is that it's not really all that dramatic. What I'm going to talk about a lot today, yes, there's drama, yes, there's romance, there's big battles, Napoleon's first defeat on a battlefield, but really what we're talking about is a series of structural changes and a series of issues with personalities that are much less dramatic, much less interesting, and much less obviously impactful than other proposed turning points, but no less important. And what I'm going to be arguing is that they are paramount, as we'll see. So, the War of the Fifth Coalition, 1809. 1809 is a world that is very friendly to Napoleon. He is essentially the master of every part of Europe that he wishes to be, with, of course, the caveat of that upper left corner. He cannot get to Great Britain, so that's out of his reach. But pretty much everywhere else is under his control in some way. He either directly controls it, the dark blue areas that you see. He indirectly controls it, the light blue areas that denote vassal states, states under French protection or control. You'll notice that includes Portugal to some degree during this period. States that are French allies, willingly or not, including the great powers of Prussia, Austria, former great power of Spain, and Russia. Russia is a French ally during this period too. And the Ottomans are off to the south doing Ottoman things. There's really nobody to challenge Napoleon on the continent in 1809. In fact, of all of the time periods between Napoleon's crowning of himself as emperor and his fall, this is the time where you'd least expect a major war to occur. But there will be one. And it has a lot to do with the personalities involved. The prime personality, of course, is Napoleon himself. He has been emperor by this point for 5 years, almost exactly 5 years. He has been in power for 10 years. He has been in active service to the French state and the French military for almost 15. And that's a telling statistic, because Napoleon famously said, or may have said, that a general has 10 good years. Well, we're moving past the point of Napoleon's 10 years, as we'll see. Napoleon is the military genius. He is the prototypical military genius, along with people like Alexander the Great. He's also a political genius. And we tend to kind of sideline the importance of his political power, his power over the French state and French empire in military history. But that's every bit as important as his role as a war leader. He can take the resources of this vast network of controlled lands, of vassals, of allies, and he can bend them towards war in a way that really no one since Alexander the Great had been able to do. And that's critically important to his ability to wage war. The fact that he is every bit as much an administrative genius as he is a military one. Now, the story of the 1809 campaign is going to take us to Habsburg Austria. And the key figure on the military side there is the Archduke Karl. We often see that spelled Charles in the French way in books. Karl is the brother of the emperor. Karl is an interesting figure. He is what passes for a military genius in Habsburg Austria. He's very smart. He understands military innovation. He understands what the French have done to move military innovation during the Revolution and Napoleonic periods, but he is hamstrung by a number of considerations. He never has the power he wants. He never has the same power that Napoleon has to be able to remake elements of the Austrian state and military, to modernize them. We'll talk about specifically why in a bit. He also lacks the crowning genius that Napoleon has. Karl is a kind of a genius, but he's a procedural genius. He has a certain kind of genius. He doesn't have an all-encompassing genius. He can't just look at a problem and fix it. He works his way through it. But if you're familiar at all with Austria of this period, or really Austria of any period, there's a lot that he has to work through. It's slow. There's a lot of bureaucracy. Austria invented the general staff in the Western world, not so they can make their military better, but just to generate more paperwork. So he has to deal with that. But he's going to be the commander of Austrian forces in this war. And we'll talk specifically about why that's so important in a bit. Now, he doesn't want war. That's a crucial part of the beginning of this process. Karl, the commander of Austrian forces, does not want to fight a war. Unfortunately, his brother does. And his brother has the only vote that counts, because his brother is the emperor. Now, you'll notice his brother is in an interesting place. His brother Franz, or Francis, he used to be the Holy Roman Emperor, and then the Holy Roman Empire went away. So he has the dubious distinction of the man who ended the only 1,000-year Reich. And he replaced it with the Austrian Empire, which will later become the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So he is in an interesting place as the senior member of his family. He is trying to navigate the waters of nationalism, of revolution, of the Napoleonic period. He's trying to keep this Habsburg state afloat. He's also worried about his brother, because Napoleon once offered Karl the Austrian throne if he would be a French vassal. Regardless of Karl's response, regardless of whether or not he wanted that offer, that automatically makes him suspicious. So when he says we need to do military reform, when he says we need to be more like the French, the revolutionary French, you can imagine how Franz hears that. Whispering in Franz's other ear is the guy you see there on the right, Stadion, the foreign minister. More or less the mover of events in Austria after their defeat in the War of the Third Coalition in 1805. Stadion wants to fight. He wants a war. He is arguably the single most belligerent person in anti-Napoleonic Europe in 1809. He doesn't listen to Karl's fears that the Austrian army isn't ready. He just wants to fight. Stadion's goal is to rid Europe of Napoleon. That's a pretty lofty goal for someone in Austria, the Austria that got smashed by Napoleon in 1805. But he wears on Franz long enough. He builds up enough court currency, enough allies, that he finally convinces Franz by the end of 1808 that it's time to go to war again. Because, of course, Napoleon is distracted in Spain. In early 1808, Napoleon takes control of Spain. Both of the Spanish kings are dethroned. Technically, they both abdicate. Napoleon is now invested in placing his brother on the throne. He's dealing with the rebellion of the Partidos. He's also dealing with the British and the Portuguese. So he's distracted. It's now time for Austria to strike. That's Stadion's message. Karl doesn't want to do it, but of course, as I said earlier, there's one vote that counts, and that's Franz's vote. So by late 1808, the Austrians say they're going to go to war. This is a bad idea. Spoilers. In previous wars, in all of the other coalition wars, there is actually a coalition. There are multiple great powers fighting against France. That's not the case here. Technically it is, because the commonality in every coalition is the British. The British are always eager to pay somebody to die for them fighting Napoleon. The problem is it's only the British in this war, as you can see. Remember, Napoleon is allied with Prussia and Russia. Even if that means they're not going to actively fight against Austria in this war, it means they're also not going to fight for Austria. And if you're the Austrians, this is a war you're going to be fighting yourself. The British are going to fund it. They will happily fund it. They're not going to put a large army on the continent. They've already got forces committed down here in Spain. But more importantly, that's just not how the British do things. They're a naval power. They're a banking power. They are not a land power. So this is Austria standing alone against the might of the French Empire, arguably at its high point. That's why I said this is a bad idea. Apparently Stadion couldn't read a map. Stadion's grand plan is that Prussia is going to enter the war on the Austrian side. If you know anything about the history between Prussia and Austria, maybe not a good idea. Russia is going to stay neutral. The German people will rise up to liberate themselves from Napoleonic rule, and they're going to win every battle. Any one of those is dubious. All of them, bad idea. But that's the plan Austria goes to war with in early 1809. So let's walk through the war. Let's talk about what actually happened in the war, because that's going to get us at why this is so important, why this conflict matters. As I mentioned, most of Napoleon's focus and a good chunk of his forces are in Spain, far away from central Germany, which is what the theater of this war will be. So you can see the forces that both sides have on hand. When the war starts, again in early 1809, Napoleon's forces are spread out in a very large area. The bulk of them, what's known as the Army of Germany, as you can see kind of in the center top of the map. He's got another force under his stepson, Eugene, down in Italy, as well as a third, much smaller force. I've labeled it a corps. It's really essentially a division, or even a brigade, under Marmont in the province of Dalmatia, which is the trading port of Ragusa, which is now Dubrovnik. So there's three major theaters, as we'll see in this war, really two major theaters and one minor. Now, this looks neat. This looks like Napoleon has all of his forces in hand and can easily deal with the problem. In reality, these forces are spread out. They're essentially on occupation duty. Most of the rest of his forces are in Spain. The bulk of his forces are in Spain. And I don't just mean that as in some of his commanders are in Spain, some of his corps are in Spain. You might notice some famous Napoleonic names are missing from this map. Ney is in Spain, Soult is in Spain, Suchet is in Spain. But also parts of these corps are in Spain. So when Napoleon takes over Spain the previous year, he pulls battalions out of these corps and sends them to Spain. Sometimes he pulls whole brigades and divisions out of these corps. The only corps that's not touched is Davout's Third Corps, which you see almost exactly in the center at the top of the map. Davout's Third Corps is the only corps that has been the same corps, same commander, same units, basically from its formation in 1804 until 1809. Every single other one of these has been picked over for senior officers, junior officers and NCOs, men, equipment, horses. So in many ways, this army is a paper tiger, which says to Austria, hey, maybe this is the time to try. You'll notice, too, if you're familiar with the Napoleonic era, one of the reasons why I picked this is on this map. And that's that the Austrians now have corps. The Austrians have adapted a lot of the French system, organizationally, tactically, ideally operationally, into their army. And the mere fact that they have corps-sized formations in imitation of Napoleonic corps, combined arms formations, miniature armies designed to act autonomously that can be drawn together into a larger field army, that's going to have a very important effect on this campaign, as we'll see. Now, the Austrian plan, Karl's plan, is to invade Bavaria. That's the beginning and end of it. The Isar River, as you can see, the Inn River, as you can see, is the boundary with Bavaria. Stadion wants to rid Europe of Napoleon, as I said. That's as far as his planning went. And so Karl thought, okay, I'm just going to advance west down the Danube and see what happens. Remember, part of this strategy is that the German people are going to rise against Napoleon, right? In particular, if you'll notice kind of at the center of the map, there's that region of the Tyrol, which is a border region between Germany and Italy. The Tyrolese do not like outsiders. They especially don't like the French. They don't like the fact that they've been given to Bavaria. They want a Habsburg back. The one place the uprising will actually happen is in the Tyrol. The people of the Tyrol will rise, in particular the largest group of them led by an innkeeper named Andreas Hofer, and that area will actually have what we would now recognize as an insurgency. Nowhere else will, but that place at least will. That's why there's an Austrian corps sitting at Innsbruck. Chastelet's job is to liaise with that insurgency and hopefully ignite it across the rest of Bavaria and then the rest of Germany. There's also this force down here under another one of the emperor's brothers. The emperor had lots of brothers. The Archduke Johann, or John. His job is to take Italy. The Austrians have very much lamented the fact that they've lost Italy, which Napoleon took from them. So Johann's job is to defeat Napoleon's protege, stepson Eugene, and take it back. And then, of course, the maneuvering that's going to happen down around Dalmatia. They want Ragusa back as well. Well, less back and more that they just want it. So Karl's going to take the bulk of the army and march it along the Danube and hopefully see what happens. If that sounds like poor military planning, welcome to Austria. Napoleon's plan is basically to survive. Napoleon is in Spain, and very early in 1809, he recalls himself because there's a conspiracy in Paris. There's a group of people, including his foreign minister Talleyrand, including his minister of police, a guy named Fouché, who's one of the great characters of the Napoleonic period. They're kind of working to maneuver Napoleon off the throne. It's not a serious conspiracy, but it's enough to bring him back to Paris. So Napoleon's in Paris when all this is happening. Napoleon knows from long history that the Austrians move slowly. That's axiomatic about the Austrian army. In fact, the great historian of the Austrian army, Günther Rothenberg, said that if you say one thing about the Austrians, they move slowly. So Napoleon expects that he has a lot of time. When he starts to see these corps gathering, this is not a fast process. This takes months. Napoleon assumes he has until the spring. He assumes he has until late March. Unfortunately, and perhaps as an indicator of how this campaign will go, the Austrians are ready much quicker than that. They're ready so quickly that, as you might have noticed, if you look at the Army of Germany's unit designator, Napoleon is not going to command it. He's going to have to resort to having his chief of staff, Marshal Berthier, command the army. Now, Berthier is the first among the marshals. He is arguably Napoleon's most trusted subordinate. He is the prototypical chief of staff. He is fantastic at taking Napoleon's orders, translating them for subordinates, and making the engine of Napoleon's war machine run. He is not a good field commander. He has never held a significant field command. And as you can see, he's been handed a giant army to deal with. He will not deal with it well. He will have no idea where his forces are, and as the Austrians are moving much more quickly than Napoleon anticipates, he will very nearly get this army destroyed, which is a problem we'll come back to in a bit. So as I mentioned, the Austrians are ready much more quickly than Napoleon expects. He expected to be kind of leisurely working his way through problems in Paris, and then to go to the front and to have the armies laid out by the end of March and then maybe start fighting towards the end of April, these are not fast-moving things. They take a while during the period. The Austrians get the jump on him. Maybe for the first and last time in Austrian history, they get the jump on somebody. Karl maneuvers his army pretty quickly, not just for Austrian standards, but for 1809 standards. West along the Danube, into Bavaria, as we've said, crossing the Inn. And remember, that's not the only part of this campaign that the Austrians have planned. Johann actually manages to make significant progress into Italy, as we'll see, fighting south, ideally trying to reclaim Italy, but at very least defeating the army there. So Napoleon is wrong-footed immediately. He doesn't have his good commanders. He's missing good chunks of his army. He's not there. So he issues orders to Berthier to reorganize the army, to pull it back, to let the Austrians extend their supply lines. Already the Austrians are having problems. Even though they're moving quickly, they get bogged down by mud and weather, traditional Austrian slowness. They average about 10 to 15 kilometers a day, which is still pretty slow for the period. And so that's going to lead us to the first part of this campaign, what's known as the Ratisbon cycle. We're going to fight a series of battles around the city of Regensburg, which the French call Ratisbon. That's where it gets its name. Berthier has a problem. That problem is that the Austrians are pretty much right in front of him, and he can't do anything about it. As the Austrians are advancing west, Berthier issues a series of orders to the corps commanders that frustrate them to no end. Basically, he has the corps commanders march back and forth. North and south sometimes, east and west. He orders Davout to occupy Regensburg, to withdraw from Regensburg, and then to retake Regensburg. Berthier had misinterpreted an order of Napoleon's for that. He's ordering other parts of the army to pull back as the Austrians are advancing. There's a few skirmishes in here. And, maybe more tellingly, to the south, Johann actually wins a battle. Johann was involved in lots of battles. This is the only one he actually won. Johann defeats Eugene, the Battle of Sacile, towards the end of this marching and counter-marching. This is a problem for Napoleon. It's a serious problem up north, but it's an even more serious problem down south, because Eugene retreats basically back to where Napoleon was in 1796. If you're familiar with the 1796 campaigns around Lake Garda, that's how much territory he's given up. He ceded the entire Veneto, and the center of northern Italy is now under threat. Not to mention the fact that there's an increasing problem up north. What's developing over these few days is the Austrians continue to push. As you can see, they cross the Danube, by and large, to the south, then march north towards Regensburg. There's a couple corps up north that are moving towards Regensburg. The problem that's developing is that Davout has become increasingly isolated. That third corps, more and more, is being left to fend for itself. Now, Davout is arguably the most skilled of the marshals. He is one of the few Napoleonic marshals who could probably win a battle on his own. But even he can't contend with the weight of the Austrian army. Even though he has a supersized corps, it's over 60,000 men, he can't deal with 150 to 180,000 that might hit him. He is, metaphorically, screaming at Berthier to extricate him. But Berthier insists that the emperor has ordered Davout to stay there. Never mind that Davout can see that that's a stupid idea. And so we're stuck. We're stuck in a very bad position. What's happening is that the line that the Austrians are drawing is pulling the French onto an east-west axis. They need to be on a north-south axis, but they're on the east-west. And increasingly, they're not really able to do anything about it. That all changes when Napoleon arrives. He's going to ride as fast as he can from Paris. Very early on the morning of the 17th of April, he's going to reach headquarters at Donauwörth, which is that way on the map. And he's going to realize that Berthier has made an absolute mess of the situation. So Napoleon's going to very quickly take command, and we learn something about Napoleon here. If we didn't already know it, we learn just exactly what it means to be a genius. Napoleon takes all these reports. Remember, Napoleon, of course, does not have fancy PowerPoints to show him where all these units are. Napoleon takes all these written reports and immediately understands them. He understands where every single unit is. Because Davout has an excellent spy organization, he knows where all the Austrian units are too. And he immediately appreciates the problem he's in, the very real danger that he's going to be defeated. So over the next couple of days, he enacts what's known as the Landshut maneuver. Now, as I said, and as you can see, the French are more or less oriented on an east-west axis, with Davout at Regensburg and the rest of the corps kind of strung out along the Danube all the way back to Ingolstadt. Napoleon is going to reorient the entire axis of the army in less than 3 days, from east-west to north-south. In particular, he's going to send Oudinot's 2nd Corps and Massena's 4th Corps to the south. This is why it's called the Landshut maneuver, because he wants to shift the axis from this direction to this direction. And that way he can push the Austrians across this series of rivers that you can see. This is not an easy thing to do. This would be a very difficult thing to do now, with modern communication methods and mapping and GPS and all of that. He's doing this by runners, by dispatch, with maps that his staff is making for him as it's happening, and they're out of date as soon as he makes them. Napoleon understands all this stuff. And this is what genius looks like. It's hard to put your finger on it, but the Landshut maneuver is probably the best example of military genius at the operational level in military history. And it works. It works spectacularly. The Austrians know as soon as Napoleon arrives that he is commanding the army, because their enemies are behaving rationally and because they're now being beaten. All of a sudden, just like they experienced in 1805, just like they experienced all the way back to 1796, they're being attacked out of nowhere by troops they had no idea were even there. And it's as dramatic as it is effective. By the 20th of April, Napoleon has shifted the army's entire axis to that north-south axis. And now he's going to finish the Landshut maneuver. He has extracted Davout from his danger at Regensburg. If you notice, Davout kind of slid down the Danube out of Regensburg, lost a regiment defending the city. Napoleon wasn't happy about that. You'll notice, too, the Austrian corps north of the Danube have kind of disappeared. Nobody quite knows what they're doing. They don't quite know what they're doing. They're just going to go wander around Bavaria for a while. While Napoleon focuses on the south. And he's going to continue the Landshut maneuver by pushing his forces across this series of rivers. And the first that he needs to cross is the Abens River. And he's going to do that by fighting the Battle of Ebensburg, pushing through the Austrian 5th Corps and the reserves that you see there. He also, in the process, creates an entirely new corps out of nothing. And he gives that corps to one of his most trusted marshals, Marshal Lannes. Pulls units, hodgepodge out of other units. That's what that blank corps is. In addition, Massena, in command of 4th Corps, is going to march north, both of them aiming at Landshut. And by the end of the 21st, after another battle at Landshut, the maneuver is finished. Napoleon has cut the Habsburg army in half. Several corps are retreating to the south. The rest of it is still trying to attack to the north. This is what command and control should not look like. Karl has no idea what his army is doing, neither do his corps commanders. They're all now just kind of wandering off by themselves, which is one of the symptoms of having to fight Napoleon. With the Austrians now where he wants them, with the situation in hand, Napoleon is now going to try to annihilate the portion of the army that's left around Regensburg. And that's going to result in the Battle of Eckmühl, named after a small town in the area, as you can see. This is where Davout wins yet another one of his long series of titles. Davout's actions in winning the Battle of Eckmühl get him his prince title. So he's the Prince of Eckmühl, again, among many other titles he wins for himself. The Austrian gamble has failed. The Germans did not rise, except for the Tyrolese, but the Tyrolese are always good for a rebellion. You'll notice what happened down south, too. Johann's little expedition into Italy didn't go so well. He did venture into Italy, then got himself defeated in another battle, and now Eugene is about to invade Hungary. This is a problem. The real problem is along the Danube, though, as you can see. Napoleon is pulling in reserves from wherever he can. He's got Marines from the Navy running security on the rivers and pulling supplies and manpower through, while the Austrians are kind of retreating and not really doing much else. Throughout May, the Austrians conduct, it's not so much a fighting retreat as it is just a retreat. There's not really much fight left at this point. And so Napoleon once again will take Vienna. Now, that of course is not the end of this campaign. Napoleon took Vienna in 1805 as well, leading to some anger by a German composer, among other things. But that's going to take us to the second part, and arguably the more impactful part of the 1809 campaign. And that's the fighting around Vienna, the two great battles fought at Vienna in the spring and summer of 1809. There you see the operating environment. The Danube does not look like this today. It's been channeled largely to allow for better transit, better use of land. At the time, the Danube is this looping river with a whole series of islands and marshes around it. Napoleon takes the city easily, the city of Vienna there on the left side of the map. The problem is the Austrian army let him have it. The Austrian army is still in good shape. They've gotten some reinforcements. They are waiting on the area to the north and east of Vienna, what's called the Marchfeld. Because, of course, one of the most difficult things for an army to do is cross a river, especially a big river like the Danube. And as you can see, that's not just a simple prospect of getting across one river. There's a lot of considerations there. The key to crossing the Danube, Napoleon tries up here, doesn't work. So he focuses instead on Lobau Island, one of the larger islands in the Danube, as a staging point across to be able to get to Charles. He doesn't have many of his forces in hand. A good chunk of his army is spread out. They're dealing with issues in Hungary. They're repressing the Tyrolese. They're trying to run Johann down. They're off fighting down in Ragusa. We start to see a little bit of Napoleon's arrogance here. Napoleon thinks that all that's left is to hit the Austrians in the face one more time and they'll fall apart. After all, they have before. So he thinks he can just quickly throw some bridges across the river and he can win the war and go back to Spain. So that's going to result in the Battle of Aspern-Essling, which I have mislabeled as Wagram. Marshal Massena, the most experienced and the other argument for the best Napoleonic marshal, pushes his 4th Corps across the river from Lobau, and immediately the entire Austrian army collapses down onto it. Now, normally, if I showed you a blank operational map of 1 corps against 4, 5, 6, you'd say there's a problem, right? Napoleon didn't see it that way. He had his best marshal commanding one of his best corps, supported by many, many more men following, including his 2 other best marshals, Lannes, having taken command of 2nd Corps, and Davout, the Iron Marshal, behind. In fact, he's so confident, Lannes decides he's going to go command one of Massena's divisions. Because why not? So Lannes ends up taking command of the right half of the army, north of the Danube, in this battle. And what's going to happen is the battle's going to develop around these villages to the north of Lobau Island. these three villages here, Aspern and Essling in particular. This is not a good place for Napoleon to be, because the Austrians know what's up. They know what they need to do, which is break the bridges. As the Austrian corps are locked together with Massena fighting around Aspern, with Lannes fighting around Essling, Béziers with the cavalry makes several charges through the center of the Austrian line to save the French position. The Austrians are sending literally everything they can down the rivers. Trash, debris. They light an entire mill on fire and send it down the river. Several times the bridges are broken. Davout is stranded. He cannot get across. Napoleon is losing his corps. And so he decides he's had enough. He withdraws. Fights a withdrawal back south across the bridges, back to Lobau Island, back to the South Bank. This is Napoleon's first defeat. It's not a questionable kind of a draw like the Battle of Eylau was in 1807. This is an outright defeat. Napoleon has ceded the battlefield to his enemies. He has not accomplished his goal. This is what Karl wanted. Karl knew that Stadion was wrong, that none of the things Stadion wanted to happen would happen. But he won his signal victory. Karl is now the first general to beat Napoleon on a battlefield. This is a costly death in other ways. Lannes, during the battle, is sitting on a wall. There's a lull in the action. He gets hit by a cannonball. One of his legs is amputated. The other one is severely damaged. Napoleon's personal physician, Dominique Larrey, inventor of battlefield medicine, does his best, but this is a crushing blow for Napoleon. Lannes dies about a week later. Lannes is the only marshal that's allowed to call Napoleon by the French informal case. He's Napoleon's friend. He's one of his most skilled subordinates. And as we'll see, that will have an effect later. But of course, Napoleon is not defeated. He's now going to take a couple of months to do this right after his failure at Aspern-Essling. He's going to turn Lobau into an artillery fortress, place hundreds of guns on it to clear the way. You'll also notice instead of the one or two bridges he built, he has built all of the bridges. He's also had his engineers drive pilings into the river to guard them. No more flaming mills. And this time, Karl realizes he's not going to get lucky twice. He places one corps to defend the crossing, and the rest is going to withdraw to the north edge of the Marchfeld. And so that's going to bring us to the culminating battle of this campaign, the Battle of Wagram. And the town of Wagram is more or less where Austrian First Corps is, at the top edge of the Marchfeld. Just like Aspern-Essling, this is going to develop around a series of villages. The village of Aderkla here, Wagram there, around to Markgraf Neusiedl on the French right. Napoleon pushes his corps across. By the 5th of July, they're more or less in the positions you see. And so the fighting is going to begin in this two-day battle along that line, the line of the Russbach. I guess it's more of a stream than a river. Surprisingly, this is also kind of a disaster for Napoleon. Instead of the grand types of maneuvers that we saw won him the Battle of Austerlitz, Wagram is more like the two armies lock and then just kind of throw hammer blows at each other. This is less the son of Austerlitz and more of the Eastern Front of World War I. You've got multiple corps standing shoulder to shoulder fighting each other, and it's not quick, it's not easy. By the second day, both armies have determined to turn the other's right flank. That's Davout's job, because of course it's Davout's job. And the unengaged Austrian corps will also do the same. And here's where we really see Napoleon's genius. During the battle on the second day, Napoleon's going to do several things that you would never want to do. He's going to pull entire corps out of line and shift them across other corps. In particular, Massena's 4th Corps marches across several other units to defend the exposed flank, in this case, the French left flank. He's going to have Eugene, at a certain point in the battle later on, fighting in 2 directions at once. Eugene has joined him on the battlefield. Johann is down here somewhere. He's supposed to join the battle, but he never does. At one point, Napoleon builds another ad hoc corps under General future Marshal MacDonald, and MacDonald decides with his entire corps he's going to make a square. Because why not? And he plows that into the enemy. At another point, there's an entire, essentially corps-sized formation of just artillery under one of his artillery commanders, Lauriston. Over 100 guns, which is a massive amount of artillery in the Napoleonic age, firing straight into the Austrian flank. Now, if I told you any one of these things had happened, you would tell me this is bad. We are violating every principle of military propriety in the Napoleonic age. But it works. There's ferocious fighting across the line, but eventually Napoleon wins the Battle of Wagram. Now, the war's not over. Charles retreats to the north. Eventually, he's run down and finally surrenders the army after another decent-sized fight at Znaim. But for all intents and purposes, the war is over. What I want to focus on by way of conclusion is why this matters. So again, romance, there's all kinds of great stories. There's a few batons won on the battlefield. MacDonald wins his baton for what he did at Wagram. There's another negative impact that we'll talk about in a second. But the structural considerations for why this matters, why this is a turning point, are, I think, what's important here. Karl had been in the process of reforming the army along French lines, as I mentioned. That process was not completed. Karl needed a few more years. But we see the fruits of it on the battlefield, especially at Aspern-Essling, but also at Wagram. He had tried to write a tactical manual in 1807 that looked like the French tactical manual. That's what you see on the left. You got skirmishers, you've got all kinds of these diverse different unit types and formations. The idea being that you have all of these different options for the commanders to choose from to defeat the enemy. Didn't really work. Tactics are about more than just changing the manual. You have to have commanders who know how to use them, know when to use them. You have to have junior officers and NCOs who know how to train and enact them. None of that exists. And Karl knew that. Shockingly, the foreign minister didn't know that, but Karl did. So this is a theory. What you see on the right is something that Karl did that's actually kind of ironic. It's not a progressive reform, it's a regressive reform. Karl decides that they're going to go back to an old Austrian tradition. They're going to go back to something they call the mass. Instead of adopting the Napoleonic square, the hollow square of infantry to resist cavalry, they're going to just stack up their units like they're fighting the Turks in 1527. They do this at the division level, they do it at the battalion level. Now, we don't really see division masses in the Austrian army in this fight, but we definitely see battalion masses. And as Napoleon is continually trying to overrun Austrian units with cavalry, these masses prevent that. And again, as Napoleon is trying to move quickly, the Austrians prevent him from doing so. Add into that the formation of Austrian corps. Now, none of the Austrian commanders knew how to use their corps. They didn't understand operational level warfare. They didn't understand that they needed to cooperate. They were used to just having a vanguard and going out and fighting and seeing what happened. But the formation of Austrian corps and some of the lower level considerations like these meant that the Habsburg army in 1809 was far more resilient than Napoleon's enemies had been, with the exception of the Russians. The Russians are kind of doing their own thing. But the other armies Napoleon had fought tended to break quickly and easily. If you hit them hard enough, they'd fall apart. The Austrians didn't do that. They didn't do it at Ratisbon. They didn't do it at Aspern-Essling, and they didn't even do it at Wagram. And they lost 2 of those 3 battles. So Napoleon now has a problem. He has predicated his entire way of war on letting the enemy make mistakes and then punishing them for those mistakes. Well, now the punishment doesn't hurt as much. That's the structural part of this that's so important for Napoleon, for his enemies. They realize during this war that they don't have to beat Napoleon. It helps if you do. But they just have to wear him down. They just have to throw forces in front of him enough that he exhausts himself. Imagine if the Prussians had actually joined this coalition. Imagine if there's a Prussian army of 80,000 men standing alongside the Austrians here. That's enough staying power for even Napoleon to have problems with. And now that those armies look more like Napoleon's, it's a lot harder for Napoleon to pull off the kind of magic that he had. Never again will Napoleon win another Austerlitz-type victory. One of these great war-ending operational maneuvers that produces a treaty with an enemy that's been humiliated. Now they know that they can stay in the fight. Again, even if they lose. To offset that, armies simply become larger. There's a pretty steady progression here, but you'll notice the jump around 1809, right? Especially if we factor out Austerlitz, there's a pretty steady trend line, and then all of a sudden it jumps. That's what happens in 1809. It's not just larger armies. It's larger armies that you're able to actually handle. One of the benefits of the corps system is it lets you handle large numbers of people at the same time. The corps commanders can maneuver their units around without having to worry about forming that unitary army or the army divided into wings, according to tradition. That enables you to handle a larger army. The more higher echelon formations you have, the larger your army can be and still be kept at least somewhat in hand. Now, once you get over 200,000, it's hard for one person to keep it in hand. That's the problem Napoleon ran into right about here. There's also human factors at work in this war. This is the one that people focus on, that Napoleon's abilities had declined. Now, this is inevitable. Napoleon's getting older, he has more considerations, he's fought a lot. He got lucky in a lot of his battles, he got really lucky at Marengo. He's not always going to have the same luck. His abilities are not declining so much. Napoleon still has all of the same abilities and powers and genius that he had in his previous campaigns. What's different about this one is that he doesn't quite leverage them in the same way. Napoleon is dismissive of the Austrians to the point of being contemptuous. He thinks he can throw small units in front of the Austrian army and win. It's kind of ironic that we were teaching Task Force Smith today in Korea in 1950. It's the same attitude. One corps, just put Massena in front of them and they'll fold, right? It had worked before. Why not do it again? Well, it doesn't work anymore because the enemy has more staying power. Napoleon's hubris and his increasing lack of realization that his subordinates are not as skilled as maybe he thought they were are going to contribute to his downfall eventually. What's more important, I think, is the leadership at lower levels. What you've got on the left is the Habsburg forces. There you have the corps commanders. You'll notice something about the Habsburgs. Another axiom about the Habsburg army is its generals are always old. The staff generals, the men who populated the Hofkriegsrat, they tended to be geriatric. Like you kind of had to be 70 to just get into it, and that was a young man in the Hofkriegsrat. Compare those to the Napoleonic leadership. With the exception of Massena, who is the old man of war, they are young for high-level commanders. The reason for this has a lot to do with who some of these people are. Pretty much everybody on the Austrian side, and you might be able to pick out a couple of the names, the Hohenzollerns, the Liechtensteins, the Archduke Ludwigs, they're all nobility. Rosenberg is an Orsini, Coloradus from one of the leading families of the multinational Austrian Empire. There's a lot of emperor's brothers in that chart. In fact, there are 4. On the other hand, Napoleon has a leadership problem. The Great Grand Armée, the one he won his great victories at Austerlitz and Jena with, is on the left. There are division commanders in that army who would make excellent army commanders. By the time we get to Wagram in 1809, we've parted off part of the Grand Armée into Spain. All of a sudden, the leadership is not what it used to be. No offense to people like Oudinot and MacDonald and Grenier and the Bavarian Vrede, they are not people like Augereau or Soult or Suchet or even Ney, the whipping boy of the Napoleonic army. As bad as Ney is, he's better than most of the people on the right. And this is an increasing problem. The churn of attrition is something Napoleon cannot beat. Napoleon cannot outthink Lannes's death. He cannot outthink the fact that half of his commanders have to be in Spain. That's a problem even he can't solve. His genius only goes so far. And if this is happening with the marshals and the corps commanders, imagine what's happening with the junior officers. When you've got 2 armies of over 200,000 men, imagine what's happening at the lower echelons. Imagine what kind of quality soldier you're talking about. When Bernadotte, that 9th Corps is Saxons. They're not even French. This will be an increasing problem for Napoleon. The larger his reach becomes, the less he is able to grasp with it. And of course, because he's Napoleon, because he's always won, he doesn't see that. So what do we take from this? What does all this mean? Well, some very important things happen as a result of this war. One of them has to do with Napoleon's marriage. Napoleon is married to the great love of his life, Josephine. Unfortunately for him, Josephine is by this point too old to have an heir. Napoleon desperately needs an heir to continue his legacy. He is still a relatively young man, but those questions can never be answered quickly enough. And so, as part of the peace deal, Napoleon divorces Josephine, pretty well locks her up in a palace until she dies in 1814, and marries a Habsburg princess, Marie-Louise. Think about what a reversal this is for Napoleon. He's been the upstart. He's been the revolutionary. He has been the anti-status quo for his whole career, right? He crowned himself rather than having the Pope do it. Now he's married to a Habsburg. There's pretty much no way more conventional to become conventional and status quo than to marry a Habsburg. And Napoleon's done that now. She will very quickly give him a son, the Duke of Reichstadt, who unfortunately will die at a very young age, as you can see. That's a sea change for Napoleon. He's now allied himself with Europe's oldest power, and this actually works. When the coalition is forming in 1813 to defeat Napoleon, the Austrians try everything within their power to not join that coalition. They try to get Napoleon to bargain. They try to get the Allies to be content with allowing France to just kind of recede to its maybe 1795 borders. It's not until the very end of the year that Napoleon finally basically tells the Austrians they're going to have to dethrone him. And then the Austrians reluctantly join the Sixth Coalition. Let's talk about Bernadotte. Bernadotte is an interesting figure. He has connections to old French royalty and nobility. He's a man who basically came from nothing. He was fired by Napoleon for retreating without orders at Wagram. Despite the fact that his corps had been shot up several times, they had just been shot up by friendly forces. They were basically running away in disarray. There's a lot of reasons to dislike Bernadotte. He's kind of this oily, arch, arrogant figure. Bernadotte's reward for being fired by Napoleon is to become the King of Sweden. The House of Sweden has no heir. They have requested that Napoleon give them one, so he unloads his troublesome marshal on the Swedes. Bernadotte's descendants are still the monarchs of Sweden. He founded a royal house that's one of Europe's few surviving ones. He becomes Karl XIV Johann. That's another important factor in all of this. Napoleon thought he was getting a satellite in Sweden. He was rudely disabused of that notion when Sweden joined the anti-Napoleon coalition in 1813. And Bernadotte, in fact, will be one of the major army commanders in those fights in central Germany, leading up to the Battle of the Nations at Leipzig. Now, what I want to conclude by saying is everything I'm arguing is only true and apparent in hindsight. If Napoleon had not invaded Russia in 1812, if he decided more or less to retire and just kind of live out the rest of his life, nothing that happened in 1809 would matter, other than the marriage, of course. But we can see the seeds of Napoleon's defeat being sown in 1809. The quality of the French army is declining. Napoleon tries to replace it with quantity, does not work. More importantly, 1809 teaches us that Napoleonic warfare requires asymmetry. It requires one army to be much better than the others. Much more maneuverable, better led, better quality, better commanded. All of a sudden, we don't have that anymore. The Habsburg army in 1809 is a mess. It's a wreck. Günther Rothenberg said that. And you don't get more authoritative than Günther Rothenberg. But it still manages to fight Napoleon to a standstill, twice. Imagine what we could do with an army that was actually decent. We'll find out. Napoleon will lose. Napoleon is also increasingly, he's not so much listening to his own legend as the kind of anti-Napoleon camp would argue. He's just doing things the way he always has. You see there in the center one of his famous statements. When someone told him something was impossible, he said that word isn't French. Because after all, if you're Napoleon, if you've always gotten lucky, if you've always won, why would you stop gambling? Why would you stop rolling those dice if they've always come up sevens? Well, when you gamble by rolling into Russia, it doesn't go so well for you, unless you're a Mongol. Increasingly, we see that the qualitative decline of Napoleon's troops will be seen in rear areas. Napoleon wins when Napoleon is in charge of an army confronting an enemy army. Napoleonic troops led by someone else tend not to do so well. Think of Eugene losing in Italy. The more Napoleon's rear areas are vulnerable, the more his enemies have French-like armies with multiple corps to contest those rear areas, the more a problem they'll be. And of course, in 1813, the Allies beat him by not fighting him, by fighting other people, mostly Ney. We've distributed warfare to the point where no one man can control it anymore. We are literally outside the range of vision of a commander. That's a problem for Napoleon, because he wants his armies in hand. He wants to command them himself. He is the god of war. He will lead them. Well, it's awesome to be the god of war, but if you're not on the battlefield, if the battlefield is 200 miles away, or even just a corps over the next hill, your corps commander is going to have to deal with that. You better hope those corps commanders are good. There's a myth that Napoleon never developed his subordinates. Napoleon absolutely developed his subordinates. Davout had literally never held a command of any significance before Napoleon made him a marshal. He developed Davout. The problem is there's not that many Davouts. And you don't have to be Napoleon to beat Napoleon. You've got to have more troops and more corps. Napoleon also can't win victory in battle. Even winning Wagram doesn't win him the campaign. He's got to chase Karl down to the north. Austerlitz, Jena Auerstedt, those are increasingly going to be ephemeral. As the Allies learn, it's okay to lose a battle. You don't have to give up. Just keep fighting. Just keep pulling on your resources. So I'll give you two conclusions. One of them is positive for Napoleon. So let's look at everything Napoleon did in this campaign. You cannot do better operationally than the Ratisbon cycle. That is the height of Napoleon and his military prowess. The Landshut maneuver is the example of operational level warfare done right. His enemies are inept. There's no better or other way to say it. Napoleon's enemy commanders, those corps commanders, they don't know what they're doing on the Austrian side. They're just kind of wandering around. They don't know how to fight distributed warfare, Napoleonic-style warfare. Their soldiers don't really know how to fight. They're not very well trained. When you're literally calling up the medieval levy from Hungary for manpower, which the Austrians did, you've got some problems with a modern army in a modern war. Napoleon nearly won the Battle of Aspern-Essling, despite huge deficiencies, despite pushing 2 corps across to fight 6 enemy corps across a river with his rear area constantly being disrupted. He still nearly won that battle. Of course, he does win the Battle of Wagram. He now has Austria as a dynastic ally with that Habsburg marriage. He has proven to the Duchy of Warsaw, to the Russians, to the Prussians, that he still has all of his old fire. And of course, you still don't want to fight Napoleon on the battlefield, right? So let me give you all those same points as negatives. What happened when Napoleon gave his army to somebody who wasn't Napoleon? Berthier? Bad things. Napoleon can't be everywhere. That might come as news to him, but he can't. He's going to have to rely on Berthiers in the future. It will not go well. The Ratisbon cycle is an early indication of that, of all the problems he'll face in the 1813 campaign. His good subordinates are dying. They're being replaced by people who are mediocre at best. Again, no offense to the McDonald's and Udanos of the world, but they're not Lon. You can't replace that. Enemy armies are becoming more symmetrical. They're looking more like Napoleon's armies. If nothing else, that means they're harder to beat. He can no longer win the decisive lightning victory. He's lost. He lost at Aspern-Essling. He lost his aura, that mystique that followed him around, that Wellington famously said was worth 40,000 men on the battlefield. He can be beaten. He is human. He may not seem like it, but he is actually human. And if you can be defeated once, you can be defeated again. Wagram was an ugly fight. There's a reason we don't focus on it much. There's not a lot of heroic paintings that come out of Wagram, because a bunch of Austrians and a bunch of French people fighting viciously over a village east of Vienna doesn't make for much romance. It's more like a lot of people killing each other and not accomplishing much. Napoleon's diplomacy is tenuous at best. All those allies that he secured and won after this war, they're really only there as long as he's winning. And plus, he has chained himself to the House of Habsburg. Yes, that might bring legitimacy to his reign. It also brings a pretty large anchor, because a lot of people in Europe don't particularly like the Habsburgs. A lot of people in Europe want Habsburg land, like the Russians. That may not be the positive it might seem to be. And of course, ultimately, Napoleon proves again and again and again his genius. And as I keep belaboring, when you remove that genius, when you have a single point of failure in your institution, ultimately it will fail in some way at some point. So what we see in this 1809 campaign is the seeds of what will later cause Napoleon's downfall. And I want to point out a couple of important books on this campaign. The arguments I've presented are largely taken from the first 2 entries here on the suggested reading list. Robert Epstein, Napoleon's Last Victory, he's the one who first pitched this idea of the 1809 campaign as this transformational event, as the birth of modern war, as he puts it, because we now finally have symmetry on the battlefield. We have 2 armies organized the same way, if not necessarily qualitatively the same. And then Jack Gill's work, his magisterial 3-volume account of the entire war, Thunder on the Danube, elaborates that. If you're interested in the Austrian side, Günther Rothenberg, Napoleon's great adversary, and then I've thrown in kind of the standard Napoleonic reading books there. So what I hope we take away from this is structural issues matter. Personal issues matter. We can focus on Spain, we can focus on Russia. It's okay if I haven't convinced you that those are less important than you might have previously thought. But hopefully what I have convinced you of is that The 1809 campaign shows us all of Napoleon's flaws. Again, only visible in hindsight. If he decided he had enough after 1811, fine. 1809 wouldn't have been a problem. But because he lost, we can see that those seeds were sown in 1809. Questions?
On the structural question, as Napoleon's armies reached that 200,000 level, is there any indication that he began to recognize that the innovations that had won him so many victories in the years prior needed a new wave of innovations?
No, that's an excellent question. That's an excellent question related to, basically, did Napoleon realize that he needed more echelons to add on to the one he created with the corps? And the short answer is no. Napoleon was actually not much of an innovator in many ways. He largely inherited a military system from the armies that preceded him, from the French Revolution. The corps is basically an outgrowth of the division system. So Napoleon did not think to add echelons beyond that. Now, in Napoleon's defense, no one really thought to add echelons above that until after World War I. So we don't really see that higher level echelon, the field army, the army group. We don't see those emerge until much later. They really require modern communications, too. You really need, at very least, wired communications for those to work right. But one of the mistakes a lot of people make is to assume that Napoleon invented everything he did, that everything just kind of popped out of his head at the camp at Bologna in 1803. But he's really an adapter. He's like the Romans, right? Didn't invent anything, but adapted really well. And now he did invent things, especially on the political side of the house. But on the military side, he's more of an adapter. And no, it never occurred to him that his reach would exceed his grasp. That's his great strength, because of course it's what motivates him to gamble, to do the things he did. A Napoleon who believed in his own fallacies would not have invaded Italy in 1797. But that's also the Napoleon who refuses to surrender after Leipzig. Yeah, it's an excellent question. Sir?
Excuse me. When Napoleon leaves the Iberian theater of war, is there an indication that the French are starting to fail without his leadership?
That's an interesting question about Spain. So Napoleon leaves Spain in late 1808. The country has been occupied by hundreds of thousands of French and Allied troops. And what I would contend is Spain is actually not a problem for Napoleon. Despite the presence of the Anglo-Portuguese army under Wellesley, who's later the Duke of Wellington, despite the partidos, despite the courts down in Cadiz, despite all of the problems of Spain, it's actually not that big a problem until it is. And the reason I say that is the Anglo-Portuguese army is sitting in Portugal. The French can't get to them. But every time a French army concentrates against them, they run back to Portugal. They don't stay to fight. That happens 3 times. So Spain requires manpower. But it doesn't require the kind of concentration and effort that the British want it to, so that the British can then later sell the myth that, oh, they beat Napoleon because of his Spanish ulcer. So what Napoleon does is he divides Spain into a series of commands, kind of under Joseph, the king, under people like Suchet, and he basically assigns them geographic areas. And, for example, in eastern Spain, what used to be the old Kingdom of Aragon, not that many problems. There's no conventional armies, really. There's a certain number of partidos, but it's largely controlled. And so it's less of a problem than it might seem. Now, when Wellesley finally does turn the corner in 1813 as the other allies are defeating Napoleon, then it's a big problem, because then there's an army invading Spain. But remember, the British do not invade, there's an army invading France. Remember, the British don't invade France until 1814. You see some of it near the border in 1813. But it's not until the Allies have decisively defeated Napoleon that the British actually venture out of kind of the area south of the Ebro. Yeah, so I think that's why I would argue Spain is less of a problem than people tend to think it is, if that makes sense. Yeah, good question. What else? Tom?
You've talked a little bit about the Napoleon's marshals becoming diluted in the campaign of 1809, and also about the junior officer corps becoming diluted. My question is, do you see that same kind of problem in enlisted ranks and troops? Namely, they're becoming less experienced, less energetic, less confident.
That's a good question. If the marshalate, if the commanders and corps commanders are being diluted, it makes sense that the men would be too. The short answer is yes. You see the same dilution. What you really see, though, is the French system is very good at intake, training, and churning out a product that's competent. What really hurts is losing the veterans, losing the elite troops. So portions of the guard are left in Spain. That's an issue, although Napoleon doesn't quite use the guard the way you might expect. And you're also losing a lot of horses. I mentioned that point earlier. It's a big deal to not have the horses you need during this period. It's not, we think of the problems of requisitioning a weapons system. You can't requisition a horse. You got to grow it. You got to train it. It takes years. And it actually takes generations to train proper cavalry in this period, because you got to breed the horses the right way you need them to work. So one of the big things that Napoleon suffers from after the 1812 campaign is he loses all his horses in Russia. So he has to try to gather together a cavalry, and it just doesn't work. His cavalry is never the same. So yeah, there's certainly a qualitative drop-off, although not as much as you might think. As I said, the French system is very good at turning people into soldiers. They're just filled by ranks of people who maybe are a little too young, a little too old, allied peoples. As I mentioned, Bernadotte's entire corps is Saxon. You've got Vreda's Bavarians running around. And those might fight well. So a lot of Napoleon's Italian troops, for example, fought just as well as French veterans. But eventually it's not going to work that well. Yeah, so the system helps to overcome that, but it's only so much it can do. It's a good question.
This is partly a question related to the horses and the cavalry. As you double the size of the armies, double the size of corps, what logistical demands are put on the corps, the armies, and in turn their commanders?
No, it's an excellent question about how, if army size is increasing, how then do we deal with supply, support, logistics? The short answer is you need more manpower for it. But of course, in a manpower-deprived army, that manpower is going to increasingly be pushed to the front, right? Especially as Napoleon starts to lose. Now, one of the great myths of Napoleon was that his logistics failed in the Russian campaign. In reality, his logistics worked wonderfully in the planning and execution stages. It's not until the disorder of the retreat comes that the logistics system fails. So the scale of the armies is matched by the scale of the staff work that goes into the armies. And the French essentially invent staff work below the general staff level. The Prussians, of course, invent the general staff, but the kind of mundane, quotidian staff work, pun intended because that word's French, that was invented by the French. So they're the ones who really put all this stuff together, saying, hey, okay, we've got armies, that's great, we've got infantry, we've got cavalry, we need people behind them to feed them. We need government organizations to do that. In 1800, Napoleon grabs the private logistics companies and pulls them into the government. So yeah, you see the same scaling in the logistical systems that you see in the army sizes, but eventually you're going to outpace it, right? So that 750,000 or so man army that goes into Russia in 1812 can only scale logistics so much to match that. And as I said, they do much better than people give them credit for in the first part of that campaign, but eventually that's going to tell as well. On the other hand, you're fighting in some of the richest, most productive, and easiest terrain in the world. So as long as you're in central Germany, as long as you're in Italy, there's always a village you can get food from. Now when you go to Poland, problems. Good question. Any other questions?
Did the French at that time have an equivalent of a West Point or Sandhurst to develop officers for the Army?
No, that's an excellent question. Did the French have essentially a staff school or a military academy? The short answer is no. And interestingly, there had been several attempts to create a kind of a staff school in France, both at the end of the old regime and through the Revolution and through the Napoleonic period. There are schools. There are plenty of schools. However, those schools are technical schools. So there's an artillery school. You need technicians in your artillery. There are schools for other branches. So there are schools for logistics, for example. But I'm glad you asked that question because it kind of circles back to that staff point. Remember, the concept of the general staff is invented by the Prussians later. So a lot of the hindsight Monday morning quarterbacking of Napoleon, his lack of developing subordinates, is basically that he didn't invent the German general staff of Moltke. There's no thought given to developing that kind of organization. To a contemporary, staff work meant detail. It meant planning marches. It meant planning logistics. It didn't mean what we think of it as this kind of professional military education flow from military academy through senior service college, if that makes sense. So the mindset is simply not there. They have plenty of mechanisms of training officers. They're basically technical schools, if that makes sense. And there are, like I said, there are efforts to kind of create staff colleges, but not the way we would think of them. Tom?
I've one other little question here, and that has to do with the Napoleon's bridging operations. That Napoleon's armies had an amazing system for portable bridging. They could lay a quarter mile of bridges in a day on demand, and they carried all that bridging with them.
Mm-hmm.
But my question is, what are all those bridging assets up to when they're trying to cross the Danube multiple times quickly at Aspern-Essling? Do you see that those bridging assets being well exercised there?
Mm-hmm. No, that's another excellent question. What were Napoleon's engineers doing during Aspern-Essling when the armies can't get across the Danube? And the answer is they are building bridges as fast as they can. The problem is the Austrians are destroying them faster than they can build them. So every time the engineers do heroic work, Aspern-Essling is the triumph of military engineering. Every time they do heroic work in frigid water, remember it's spring in Austria, the water's not warm. Every time they do that under fire, under constant attack, a giant mill that's on fire comes and breaks the bridge. So you can have as many bridging assets as you want, and the French do have far and away the best military engineers of all the major powers, but there's only so much you can do against that kind of physics. And that's why you see at Wagram, Napoleon builds all the redundant bridges and all the defense systems, because he had basically tried to jump the gun and not gone through the proper staff process, if that makes sense. Yeah, good question. Anything else? All right, thank you all for coming. Next month, this is a Wednesday talk because of some other things going on here at the Dole Center. Dr. Gates Brown will be here the first week of February, first Wednesday of February, to talk about the Tet Offensive and how it's the turning point in the Vietnam War. So hopefully we'll see you all there. Thank you for coming.